Here we're going to just talk about straightforwardly what critical thinking is, at least according to the paradigm of critical thinking that will guide this course. Obviously, if it's critical thinking that we're asking about, we're going to say that critical thinking is thinking that is critical. So that leaves us with the key term, critical. What is critical? What is it about thinking that would make it critical? Well, the word critical comes from criterion, which is derived from a Greek word, criterion, just spelled with a K. Criterion comes from the root krites, which means to judge, or it means a judge. Therefore, criterion means a tool or standard of judgment. So critical means by means of and according to tools or standards of judgment. And therefore, critical thinking will be thinking by means of and according to criteria, that is, tools or standards of judgment, which tells us that judgment is an essential element in critical thinking. For that is what the tool and standard, the criteria that we're using to think along with, is designed to do, to make a judgment. What then is a judgment? If critical thinking always involves a judgment, we need to ask what that is. Judgment is a decision. It's a decision to believe something, that is to take it as true, to disbelieve something, that is to take it as false, or to suspend judgment on the question, and that is also a judgment. It would be appropriate to suspend judgment on a question where we don't have enough available information in order to substantiate a good reason for making a judgment either way. Since judgment is a decision, it's something that we are responsible for. And the responsible decision is the one that's based on evidence. Evidence would be reasons for actually believing that something is either true or false. In the book, we discussed the example of a judge who has to decide in a case where the defendant was charged with driving recklessly. And we described that situation in a number of ways. One of the elements of the situation that we thought was sort of imagine where that he would have been driving recklessly in order to save the life of a child, for example. And we found that there are a number of things that a judge would have to make a judgment on. He would have to decide whether it is true or false that in fact the defendant drove recklessly, and that the reason he drove recklessly was in fact to save the life of a child. He would have to decide whether it's true that saving a life is of higher value than obeying the traffic law, in circumstances where disobeying the traffic law would be necessary to save the life. And he would then also have to decide whether we should punish the defendant. And from analyzing that situation, we found that there are different kinds of things that one must judge the truth or falsehood about. Those are the facts, the straight facts, right? What actually happened. And that's what's going on in the first two items there. Is it the case that the defendant drove recklessly? And is it in fact the case that the reason he drove recklessly was to save the life of a child? The third one is a question of what is of more or less value. Something we might call not simply a question of fact, but a moral question. And the fourth one is a decision about what ought to be done. And all of these things are matters of truth or falsehood. It's just that there are different sorts of questions that we are actually considering. And so in all of those cases, we consider the judgment to be a matter of deciding whether something is true or false. We also reviewed some questions about debate, since critical thinking and logic are tools that are often used in debate. And at the same time, debate can be a useful tool for the process of critical thinking. But we have to consider some of the ethical dimensions of debate and therefore also of critical thinking. We take it as an axiom, I suppose, that the purpose of thinking is to ascertain the truth. Now, this is a question that we can actually ask ourselves whether or not we have good reason to believe that the purpose of thinking is to ascertain the truth. And that's kind of it's a bit of a philosophical issue. I think that a case can be made for that, but it's not really the right place here to make that case. So we're going to lay it down here as an item, almost an axiom, and it's going to be a guiding principle in the approach that we take to critical thinking in this course. And there is definitely a spiritual element to that for Muslims. If you believe God created the intellect, then using it for that purpose would be something like an act of worship. That's to say, using the intellect for the purpose for which he created it, using the intellect to ascertain the truth. Because the intellect can also be used for the opposite of that. The intellect can be used for devising a strategy to get what you want, regardless of what the truth is. The intellect can be used for creating means of self-deception and deception of other people. And so in that case, we would have to consider that a misuse of the intellect, the use of the intellect for a purpose other than, or indeed opposite of that which it's created for. So how does that come into the ethics of debate, and why would we talk about the ethics of debate? Well, because debate is a kind of interpersonal engagement, a mode of discussion, which is natural to human beings. Human beings do it. And it's one in which critical thinking is operationalized most often. So debate is kind of like cooperative critical thinking. It can be like cooperative critical thinking when it's done in the right way. And it's done in the right way when your aim is to get to the truth. When your aim in the debate is to actually use the discussion as a means to ascertain the truth in a cooperative manner. And it's bad when your aim is only to win the argument for whichever reason that you would want to win the argument. Because, again, that would be a misuse of the intellect on the premise that the purpose of thinking is to ascertain the truth. The test of that is whether you are just as happy to learn that the other person is right and that you're wrong, so long as you've arrived at the truth in the process. And I'm drawing this from reflections that Abu Hamid al-Ghazali shared in his book Ihya Ulumuddin, in the section called Kitab al-Ilm, or the Book of Knowledge. In the end of that section, he discusses debate and the ethics of debate, when it's appropriate, when it's good, when it's something harmful, and how to know. And that's where he mentioned this test. So debate is something which is useful and good when it's done with the right purpose, with the right intention, and when that intention is to ascertain the truth, because that purpose is in fact the purpose for which the intellect was created, and therefore the purpose for which thinking should be engaged in. That is the end of the summary of the chapter of the book, discussing or dealing with the question, what is critical thinking? Right, student to read that chapter to more fully understand it. And perhaps this summary video will be of some assistance in understanding that, although I think that this part of the book is not hard to understand. In any case, if you haven't read it, perhaps this little video would motivate you to read it. All right. Thank you for listening to this second video summary for the course. And I hope that it was helpful, and that you will continue on in the course. Hopefully the next video will be even better.